Welcome back to the final speaker of the day. And I don't know if Stan remembers, but I first met him at a conference held by the late Graham Birdsall in Birmingham, I think it was, back in 1993. And it was wonderful to exchange conversation with such an incredible mind, standing outside the building while waiting for the doors to open to the conference. Stanton T. Friedman has both a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degrees in physics, and was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist for such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet, General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas on such advanced, classified, eventually cancelled projects as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and nuclear power plants for space. Since 1967, he's lectured on the topic, Flying Saucers Are Real, at more than 600 colleges and over 100 professional groups in 50 states, 9 provinces, and 14 other countries. He's published more than 80 UFO papers and appeared on hundreds of radio and TV programs. He's the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident and co-authored Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident. As well as Top Secret Magic, his explosive book about the Majestic 12 group, established in 1947 to deal with crash saucers. Stanton Friedman takes a clear-cut, ambiguous stand that some UFOs are alien spacecraft, that the subject of flying saucers represents a cosmic Watergate, that none of the anti-UFO arguments made by a variety of noisy negativists stand up to careful scrutiny, and that we're dealing with the biggest story of the past millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft and the successful cover-up by governments of the best data. Alien wreckage and bodies recovered in New Mexico for 58 years. And what a truly marvelous moment when Stan was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award in Leeds, England, in September of 2002 by UFO Magazine of the UK. A documentary, Stanton T. Friedman is Real, was broadcast in Canada 2002. And we're delighted to introduce the very real Stanton Friedman to present to you the very real government UFO lies.
Thank you. Do I need to use this thing? That mic? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm told that I can make up for lost time. I'm not going to talk faster to get the talk done sooner. I'll take the time that we were delayed and extend that. A couple of things. One is that if you haven't already, you should buy the proceedings for the conference. There's a copy of my paper, which I will not read to you, a copy of a lot of other papers, including one by Alan Holt, who isn't here, so you can't possibly hear his, and a statement by Edgar Mitchell. If you're wondering about a luncheon companion for tomorrow noon, I understand they've gotten up to $1 a pound on me back there for the silent auction. I don't think people very often use the word silent in conjunction with me. And I know some of you with sensitive hearts and souls may be upset that I would use a lecture title that suggests that the government lies. We all know that governments don't lie to their people. Some of the time. Most of the time they do, but that's another story. Okay. Tonight, I do want to, rather than just talking about the cosmic Watergate, focus on specific false statements made by various government agencies and individuals about UFOs. This is not a charismatic hand-waving, well, they lie all the time, you can't believe anything they say. No. I'll deal with specifics. You may be able to read my slides. I'm not sure if I can from here, but we'll give it a whirl. Let's turn the projector on. And in the first slide, I don't even know what we're going to see. Yes, I would have brought him along, but I couldn't get him a visa since I live in Canada, you understand. I guess you could call me an alien too, can't you? A guy had great fun taking a bunch of pictures like this, and I couldn't resist using it. Let's look at the next slide, and you'll see I have to show you a UFO picture, you understand. That's part of the rules of the game, and you can barely see the UFO up here, but look at the next slide, and you'll see an enlargement, and I use this one in honor of my living in Canada. I'm a dual citizen. I can complain about both governments legally. This was investigated by Dr. Richard Haynes, former NASA scientist, collected over 4,000 pilot sightings, worked with astronauts, worked with abductees, was interviewed for the Peter Jennings Monster Show, and none of it was used. Typical of what you might expect, I guess. Let's look at the next one. I show this one. There's much more to the picture and so forth, but I hope some of you, well, I'm not sure I hope so, but some of you must have seen the Larry King special a couple of weeks ago, in which the UFO experts in the form of Dr. Seth Shostak, one of the SETI cultists, as I call them, and Dr. Susan Clancy, of Harvard, they identified these pictures, well, just somebody tossing a hubcap. The fact that they'd been analyzed by Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist, at great length was beside the point. You don't need to look at the evidence. Why should we do that? We know that there's nothing to this. As you might determine, I'm a little bitter about the garbage that's been dumped on the public by some of the nasty, noisy negativists. This is from Santa Ana, California, one of the Rex Heflin photos. Exhaustive analysis in Ain't a Small Object Close to the Camera. Let's look at the next one. There's me and Dr. Shostak. I think he will be shocked. He sent me a picture. We were both on the Queen Elizabeth II a year and a half ago, and we each gave 3 lectures. Now, we attended each other's lectures, but he obviously didn't hear anything of mine, or totally ignored the evidence that he did hear. But he took my picture, and he sent me a copy to do with as I pleased, and it will be on the back of the new edition of my book, Top Secret Magic, due out next week. And it gives him credit for it. He's a good photographer, doesn't know anything about flying saucers. It was an interesting discussion on Coast to Coast one night when we did 3 hours. Let's look at the next slide. Okay. Government UFO lies. Definition, lie. An untrue statement made with intent to deceive. It's not just enough that it be untrue, but there has to be an intention to deceive. That's a Webster's definition. Let's look at the next slide. That looks awful dark. This is the cover of the largest study of flying saucers ever done for the United States Air Force, Project Blue Book, Special Report 14. If 13 anti-UFO books don't even mention it, even though all the authors were aware of it. We have to review the 4 basic rules for UFO debunkers. And for those of you who want to debunk anything else, these work just as well for that too. First, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Second, don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Third, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. And fourth, do your research by proclamation, as Dr. Shostak and Dr. Clancy did the other day on Larry King. Investigation is too much trouble. Let's look at the next slide. Here's what was said about this report by the Secretary of the Air Force, mind you. 1955, very wide distribution for the press release, none for the report. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. There's the date on that. That's what he said. Two facts. Unknown 3%. Oh, you're not using that. I thought you were using two of them. Oh, dear. Getting old. Let's look at the next slide. This is a definition of unknown. This designation is the identification code was assigned to those reports of sightings wherein the description of the object and its maneuvers could not be fitted to the pattern of any known object or phenomenon. That seems reasonable to me. The kicker comes when we look at the next definition. In the next slide. Insufficient information. They had a separate category. This identification category was assigned to a report when, upon final consideration, there was some essential item of information missing. Now, here's the important thing. It is emphasized that this category was not used as a convenient way to dispose of what might be called poor unknowns. Now, let's look at the facts from the study in the next slide. This is the categorization. 3,200 sightings, pretty good number. For those of you who worry about such things, this is really psychological aberrations. A nice way of saying crackpot cases. Here are the unknowns. They were, of course, only 3%. Oops. They weren't 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 10. They were 21.5%. I call that a lie. Flat out, unambiguous lie. The unknowns were not 3% or even close. Equally important is that category we just mentioned, insufficient information. If there wasn't enough data available, it was not an unknown. And yet, over and over again, in the 50 years or so since this came out, we hear the only reason sightings couldn't be explained is that there wasn't enough data. It wasn't true then, it isn't true now. Let's see the facts and not the fiction. Now, on top of that, they did a quality evaluation of all those sightings. Let's look at the next slide. Of the excellent cases, only 35% were unknown. Only is an Air Force word. Whenever they mention unknowns, it's only. Now, what if I was talking about cures for cancer? We looked at 3,201 drugs, and I guess there aren't any cures for cancer. Now, leave that one up there, please. Please, we got to look at the rest of the data there. Only 35% of the best drugs worked. I guess there's no cure for cancer. And you'd say, hey, you're crazy, man. All it takes is one. But the better the quality of the sighting, moving up, the more likely to be an unknown. Exactly the opposite of what you'd expect, based on the Air Force statement, and precisely what you'd expect if the unknowns were really something different. So they lied to give us a totally false picture of what was going on. Now we can look at the next slide, please. Now, I'm going to talk about Roswell for a bit, and I'm not sure what you can read. There's a point to showing you, these are front page newspaper headlines from evening papers from Chicago West, July 8th, 1947. And buried someplace in this story, it says, found last week. Found last week. This is the Chicago Daily News. Next slide. Oh boy, that looks rather strange. Anyway, Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Don't know what happened to the slide. Are there two slides in there? Anyway, the same idea. Let's look at the next slide. We're moving across the country. Spokane Chronicle, Army declares flying disc found. And you'll find the word found last week in there too. Next slide. This is my favorite from Los Angeles. Well, it's pretty much, oh, interesting. Magic. M-A-J-I-C, of course. Army finds flying saucer. Now, already the fix is in. 4 hours after the press story went out, General believes it is radar weather gadget. Air Force says platter picked up on ranch. Platter now, you see. And the article has grown from a few column inches all the way down the front of the paper. This is the late racing results edition. So the lies started early. How do we know this is a lie? Well, in 1994, the Air Force admitted they lied. That's a little while to get over it. Then they told another lie to get rid of that lie. So we have 4 stories. The first one is flying disc found. The word UFO is not in use. Then radar weather gadget. Then, whoops, mogul balloon. And the fourth one is about the bodies, and we'll see that in a minute. Now, the kicker here is that mogul balloon doesn't fit. The descriptions of the wreckage by the people who were on the site say it wasn't a mogul balloon. In addition, something the Air Force doesn't bother to tell you, they say it was a mogul balloon found in mid-June. Now, anybody who has ever looked at a calendar knows that 1 week prior to July 8th is not mid-June. And neoprene weather balloons turn to ashes in the sun in New Mexico in about a week. And you've seen these television programs where they have these beautiful teardrop-shaped, huge polyethylene balloons. None at all were used for mogul balloons at that time. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. It looks much better. Now, there's more to the lies. Let's look at the next slide. The author of the first of the big Air Force reports, the mogul balloon man, whose specialty, honest to goodness, was disinformation, Colonel Weaver, he talks about a document that was found years and years ago, back to the late 70s, a memo, an FBI memo. And I was going to say quotes from it, he sort of quotes from it. He said, the memo says, the object found resembles a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector. He skipped the stuff inside of brackets and went on to say, disc and balloon being transported. What the rest of the line is but that telephonic conversation between their office and Wright Field had not borne out this belief. He leaves that out, so it turns the meaning 180 degrees. That's a lie. And even though the report's the size of a New York phone book, he doesn't include a copy of the FBI memo. Don't bother with the facts. My mind's made up. Let's look at the next one. The next slide, you'll see, you can't see. This is an actual copy of the FBI memo, and the words that I mentioned are right in there. But nobody reading his report would know that. Let's look at the next slide. Now, Colonel Weaver, in order to tabloidize the story, I don't know if there is such a word, but make it sound like it came from a tabloid. I made that up. In 1978, he said, an article appeared in a tabloid newspaper, the National Enquirer, even spelt it wrong, which reported the former intelligence officer, Marcel, that's Jesse Marcel Sr., claimed that he had recovered UFO debris near Roswell in 1947. Also in 1978, a UFO researcher, Stanton Friedman, that's me, can't say scientist, you know, that would be too honest, met with Marcel and began investigating the claim that the material Marcel handled was from a crashed UFO. Similarly, 2 authors, William L. Moore and Charles Berlitz, also engaged in research, which led them to publish a book, The Roswell Incident, in 1980. Now, what's wrong with this? That's a pretty straightforward account. The Enquirer article, after all, where could they find out about it unless Marcel had come running to them? Well, there is another place they could find out about. They could find out about it from me because the article appeared in 1980, and I worked with Bill Moore. We did 95% of the research in the Roswell incident. It was ready for publication in 1980, and I contacted Bob Pratt, a reporter for the Inquirer, whose articles were more accurate than those I've seen in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I gave him the contact information for Jesse Marcel, because I trusted him, and his article was straightforward and good. And I don't get my leads from the Inquirer. I gave them the lead. So in one short paragraph, we've tabloidized the story. Other people have picked up on that, the noisy negativists. Everybody knows the Inquirer pays for their stories, one guy said, a professor with a PhD from Brandeis. More balderdash. But I can't call him government, so you won't blame him for that. Let's look at the next slide. Now, here was the story the next day. Harassed rancher, this is in the Roswell Daily Record, who located saucer, sorry he told about it. Now, there are a couple of important things here. One, the last line is the rancher saying, one thing I'm sure of is it was not a weather balloon. Now, Colonel Weaver quotes from this article at length, but he leaves that part out. And he also leaves out the fact that they say it covered an area 200 yards in diameter. What difference does that make? Well, in his big fat report, he has another colonel, Sheridan W. Cabot, intelligence officer who went out with Jesse Marcel, saying that all of a sudden, after 20 years of not telling the truth, he has an epiphany and tells Weaver, oh yeah, I remember, that was just a weather balloon, immediately recognized it as such, covered an area about 20 feet square, easily fit in one vehicle. From 200 yards in diameter to 20 feet square. That's one heck of a shrinkage. In addition, if that's all there had been, the rancher would have brought it into the base, to the sheriff's office anyway, and there would have been no reason for Major Marcel and Cabot to go out there. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. It's a deliberate lie. Why would he lie? I'm not a psychiatrist. I would point out he was a veteran getting a very good pension and with medical benefits and all the others. And if one colonel tells another one, this is what you ought to say, it wouldn't be too surprising if he followed the advice. Now, let's look at the next slide. Oh, this is one of the pictures taken in General Ramey's office, and you can see that there's print there. Well, I think you can see there's print there. But the Air Force says they gave it to another agency and they couldn't find anything there. And I should point out, incidentally, this was taken with very high resolution, speed graphic. If it was taken with one of today's standard digital cameras, you wouldn't be able to read it because the resolution wouldn't be good enough. That's my plug for using slides instead of PowerPoint. I'm going to have to, when I sell enough books so I can fit in the scanner I got last night to take home to me, and then I won't have any excuse for not making up PowerPoint presentations. But Dr. David Rudiak has done a nice job on this, and it includes things like victims of the wreck. This is taken in General Ramey's office. Just for kicks, a little lie here and there, you know. Don't tell me that the CIA couldn't do as well as we could. Interestingly enough, it's also claimed that the so-called strange hieroglyphic-like figures on the balloon materials were really from a kind of toy company tape, which had little strange figures on it. Amazing that the Air Force, with all its resources, never found a picture of any such tape, and the high-resolution pictures don't show any such tape. I call that a lie, too. Let's look at the next one. This is the front page of the Alamogordo Daily News. This appeared on the 10th of July. On the 9th, they staged a launch. Fantasy of flying disc is explained here. They stage it for the newsmen. This goes all the way down the bottom of the page. Newsmen watch Army radar crew launch disc in quotes. All three pictures deal with it. Another total lie. The wreckage characteristics do not fit. Balsa wood was used for these things because it was very light and the lifting capacity of balloons is very limited. The paperback foil that was used for the radar reflector, easily torn by a 3-year-old. But the witnesses said you could fold it and fold it and fold it and it would unfold on its own and you couldn't tear it. And the little I-beams had the weight of balsa wood, but you couldn't break them, burn them, cut them. Not balsa wood. Next one. There's the first volume. It starts with a lie on the cover. That's the hat that the rancher, Mac Brazel, wore, but he never said he saw anything in the sky. He said the stuff covered an area 3/4 of a mile long and a few hundred feet wide, and they don't report that. Let's look at the next slide. One of the things that was said in that first report was that this is our last word on the subject of Roswell. Another lie. Just before the 50th anniversary, they came out with Volume 2, the Roswell Report, Case Closed. You notice that the title on the first one, the Roswell Report, Truth versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. The Air Force supplied the fiction. There are several lies in it. You got to tell it like it is, folks. This one has that wonderful explanation. Another lie. Let's look at the next slide. They explained away the reports of bodies, crash test dummies, which we dropped all over New Mexico. The dummy's the one in the middle, in case you're wondering. That's Sierra Sam. Now, I managed to locate retired Colonel Madsen, who's this man. Of course, I talked to him many years later. This picture was taken way back when. And he pointed out two serious objections to the crash test dummy explanation. One, for the test to be meaningful, the crash test dummies had to be the same size and weight as pilots. They were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. The stories about the bodies in Roswell all talked about skinny little guys with big heads, 3.5, 4 feet high. There's no way you can squish that thing down and get something that makes that look like a little alien. The second thing is, of course, a minor detail. None of them were dropped before 1953. The Air Force invented time travel for crash test dummies. I wish they could invent it for me. It would have made my trip here a lot faster. They also used a map in the report 3 times. Anthropomorphic test dummy drop locations. Amazing thing, they showed the 2 important crash sites, Mac Brazel's ranch and out in the plains of St. Augustine. None were dropped near either one of those. It's like the guys doing the dropping were told, hey guys, don't drop anywhere, their saucers crashed. Now let's look at the next slide. They told another lie in that report. There's Colonel Joseph Kittinger. He's in the Pilots Hall of Fame, and he was crazy enough to jump from a balloon at over 100,000 feet. Great pilot, no question about that. I had heard 2 different stories independently of a nasty red-haired officer and a black sergeant, one at the base hospital, one out in the plains of St. Augustine site. And here comes Joe Kittinger in this report saying, hey, that was me. I was a redhead back then. We had an accident with one of the balloons, the gondola, if you will, crashed and somebody injured their head, and it was close to the base hospital in Roswell, so we went there. One thing wrong with the story. It happened in 1959. 12-year time travel for that story. That's a lie. L-I-E, a lie. Our own government. We pay their salaries. You'd never know it from the way they act toward us, but let's look at the next slide. Now, in a standard response, and pretty much saying the same thing since 1968-9 when Blue Book was closed, in a letter to Senator Patty Murray from Washington State, one of her constituents asked her to find out about Roswell. So she wrote a letter to the Air Force, and their Air Force congressional liaison sent back the standard letter, Colonel Schubert this time. It's in my book, Top Secret Magic. The letter takes up a page. My pointing out all the deficiency in it takes up 5 pages, but he makes 3 major points. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of threat to our national security. Now, what does that mean? What if one of those 3 functions, reporting, investigating, and evaluation, leave it up there, please. We don't want to get rid of the idea here, was performed by somebody else? You know, the National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, Office of Naval Intelligence, the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. There's a whole bunch of these guys. If any one of those functions was done by one of those, then this would still be a true and totally meaningless statement. In the second place, it's the wrong question to ask. The penguins in Antarctica are not a threat to the security of the United States. They're certainly real, but even the basic assumption is wrong. How do I know? Well, let's see what the Air Force itself has pointed out at times in the past. Let's look at the next slide. In 1952, the biggest year on record for Project Blue Book, you will find several articles, jets told to shoot down flying discs. That's July 29th, my birthday, 1952. They are told if the saucer doesn't want to land when you tell it to, shoot it down. Can you picture that? I mean, the cartoonist would have a field day with that. The pilot waving at the saucer, hey, go on down there. And the saucer thumbing his nose in return. Don't take these off quite so quickly, please. Let's look at the next one. The next slide. Well, maybe no, you missed several slides there. There we go. No, go back another one. Another one. No, go back another one, please. And go back another one. Well, we may get through these. Here's an important one. This is forward, actually, but there's another clipping of pilots told to shoot down flying saucers. And another one, where the head of the American Rocket Society writes a letter to President Truman, and I have a copy of the letter, saying he thinks that's a bad policy. I think it is too. What if they shoot back? And I think they have. But equally important, in one of the newspaper articles, it quotes Roger Ramey. He's the guy who was holding that piece of paper. But then he was only a brigadier general. Now he's Major Roger Ramey, Chief of the Air Force, whatever that word is, I can't even read it. Something, Air Force Jet Operations? No. Okay. You all know what it says. They have scrambled jets hundreds of times as a result of repeated sightings of unidentified objects. Hundreds of times. Now, are you telling me that the Air Force is scrambling jets hundreds of times after UFOs, but they're not a threat to the security of the United States? And you've ordered the pilots to shoot down the UFOs, and they're not a threat to the security of the United States? That's nonsense. You don't order them to shoot something down if you don't think it's a threat to the security of the United States. And because some people protested about Frank Foschino's book, The Braxton County Monster, The Truth About the Flatwoods Monster Revealed. I wrote the foreword and the epilogue. And Frank talks about dogfights between UFOs and our interceptors. That happened September 12th, 1952. We started looking. You can't believe how many jets crashed, how many planes disintegrated, how many jets were never found. And as I mentioned in the book, I heard at that time 6 separate instances, and I've since heard of another, Dr. Bruce Maccabee has it on one of his websites, where more planes went up after the flying saucer than came back. And they're not a threat to the security of the United States. Now, it may be they're responding to our being nasty toward them. That's a separate question. But clearly the government lied. Oh, there we go. Air Force orders jet planes to shoot down flying saucers if they refuse to land. We were very nervous at that time. We expected the Russians to invade. And we had a lot of our good planes in Korea in the summer of '52. And Stalin had just shown that he had nuclear weapons, getting bigger and bigger each test that they ran, and that they had planes with long enough range to deliver them. So we were certainly nervous on the East Coast, but one of the interesting things is that there were 3 different pilots who had over 100 missions in Korea, where there were MiGs chasing after them, that crashed without any MiGs chasing after them. Same thing was happening in England. Lots of planes going up and not coming down, or coming down whammo, crasho. The real situation, in other words, is very different from what the public was being told. Let's look at the next slide. This is that urges U.S. Air Force not to shoot saucers. Good idea, don't shoot at them. Let's look at the next one. Oh yeah, they buzzed the ground 30 feet off the ground, our jets. That's totally against every rule around. Could they have been chasing something? Sounds like a good reason to me. Next slide. Okay, here's his third reason. We'll get back to the second one later. There has been no evidence indicating that sightings categorized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles. We are not aware that any other governmental department or agency other than the National Archives possesses any records pertaining to UFOs. Gee whiz, Bruce Maccabee got 1,600 pages from the FBI. The CIA said they didn't have anything. Oh, well, when we went to court, oh, yeah, well, there's 900 pages about UFOs. And, oh, yeah, well, here's a list of 57 other documents we found, which we can't release, from all kinds of other agencies, but the Air Force doesn't seem to know about them. 18 of them were from the super secret NSA. And when we went after them in court, they found 239 UFO documents. We only knew about 18. But the Air Force, in its infinite wisdom, doesn't know about anybody else having any UFO documents. Is this ignorance? I'd say it was bliss, I suppose, but and no evidence indicating that sightings categorized unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles. In other words, we have no reason to think that vehicles that are round, can stop dead, can move straight up and down, can make right-angle turns at very high speed, can fly circles around our airplanes, are extraterrestrial. We can't make them. Nobody on this planet that we know can make them, but they're not extraterrestrial. What in the heck are they then? They're manufactured. They're craft. They're not just lights in the sky. There are physical trace cases. Right now, Ted Phillips in Missouri has collected more than 3,000 such cases from 90 countries. You know, a U-2 or an SR-71 that could land in a space not much bigger than itself and take off from that and has little guys on board walking around. 16% of those cases involve reports of critters. But they're not extraterrestrial. Maybe they're ultra-terrestrial. That's a new word. I like that one. Let's look at the next slide. Here's one from J. Edgar Hoover. Some of you are old enough to remember old J. Edgar. He ran the FBI for what, 50 years? Something like that. He's quoted in letters to people who are asking about the FBI and UFOs. The investigation of UFOs is not and never has been a matter within the investigative jurisdiction of the FBI. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but when Bruce Maccabee used freedom of information to go after the FBI, they released 1,600 pages of FBI UFO information. And I guess it wasn't in their jurisdiction. They just got involved. I call that a lie. Same thing happened in Canada, incidentally. Somebody asked the Defense Research Board, "What are you doing about UFOs?" "Oh, we're not doing anything." And then you get minutes of classified meetings held the very same week as that letter response was sent of a committee set up to review UFOs. The U.S. government isn't the only one that lies. Let's look at the next slide. Funny little story. A number of years ago, I filed Freedom of Information Privacy Act requests for my files from the FBI and the CIA. I gave them complete information, Social Security number, date and place of birth, that I'd had a security clearance, blah, blah, blah. I knew the FBI did my security clearance and the renewals, 2 renewals. And I get back a response from the FBI first. "We have no files on you." Then I hear from the CIA, "All we have on you is a negative name check request from the FBI, and here's the file number." So I send it back to the FBI. "Oh yeah, we do have a file on you. We checked again, but it's classified." I send another letter. "How big is the file and what level is the classification?" That information is also classified. So first they flat out lie. I told them that I had a Q clearance and I gave them the time period when I had it. How many Stanton Terry Friedmans are there around with my birthday and born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and with my Social Security number? How can you get confused about that? Thank goodness for the CIA. These guys don't like each other is the conclusion I've come to, But the CIA also lies. Let's look at the next slide. Now, the CIA, when we went after them, they claimed that they were not involved until the Robertson panel in 1953, and that's all there was. So we go to court. That's when they turn up these 900 pages. Nothing above secret. There should have been top secret materials there. But if they can get away with it, they lie. Now, to follow up on the story a little bit, when the NSA did their court-ordered search, because of the CIA finding 18 NSA documents, which the CIA, by law, could not release, we went after the NSA, do a court search. The court ordered them to do a search. We knew about 18. They found 239 UFO documents. But 79 are from other agencies, believe it or not, 23 of them from the CIA, which hadn't found them when it did its court-ordered search. You subtract the 79, that leaves 160. We said, fine, we'll take them. We can't. Sources and methods, sources and methods. It's against the law. We cannot release sources and methods information. S&M, that has a different meaning, doesn't it? Going after the government is an S&M kind of thing, I guess. Okay. They said they can't release them. We go to court. They put out a top-secret affidavit to the judge justifying not releasing their 160 UFO documents. The judge in the federal court case agrees with them. Our lawyer doesn't get to see the documents. He doesn't get to see any of the documents, but he sees a 21-page, legal-size Classified affidavit, top secret umbra, we found out later. The public interest in disclosure, he said, is far outweighed by the potential danger to the security of the United States should that information be released. Remember, they said no threat to the security of the United States, and now he's saying we can't release it because of the threat to the security. We went to the Federal Court of Appeals. They got the same affidavit. They agreed with the lower court. Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case. We filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the affidavit, and we got it. And some of you may have seen the many times that I've shown that on television, that original affidavit. It's 75% blacked out. So I used to turn pages and just chit-chat. You know, the first page isn't highly blacked out, but guaranteed to get laughter. All this stuff has sources and methods, folks. Well, after a number of years went by, they changed their rules a little bit, and they did release a much less highly blacked out document. It was only 20% blacked out. And they claimed they released the 156, actually, 160. They threw out 4 of them, documents. Wow, we're getting all those NSA documents. Well, not exactly. I talked to the gal at the NSA when I asked for a new set because I heard, because of a new executive order, they were putting out a set. She was reading an article by Philip Klass complaining about my showing those blacked out documents. And he never says there's sources and methods information, which of course I always said. So I get the 156 NSA UFO documents, and they are not all blacked out. They're whited out. You can read about 2 lines per page. Nothing covered up. It's much less effective on television, though, I'll tell you that. Black is good. See, it shows up very clearly. Oh, incidentally, I went after the 23 UFO documents that the CIA had not released, but that the NSA noted. Took me over 2 years to get the first 9, which were, believe it or not, press abstract of Eastern European newspaper articles about flying saucers, which the Russians had the day they were published. Their own 14 they withheld. I appealed. And I got a letter from them before appealing. If you have any questions, call this number and ask for Chris. No last name, honest to God. So I did call, and I talked to Chris. And he says, well, you're not going to appeal, are you? I say, of course I will. Well, you don't expect to get anything, do you? Of course I don't. But Phil Klass will say I'm too lazy if I don't appeal. So I appealed, and a couple more years, total of 5 years from the initial push, I got 4 documents. And you'll see one in a minute, which 2 of them you can read 8 words on the page. Real exciting stuff like date, Soviet, doc number, real informative. All the rest is blacked out. All right, let's look at the next slide. Oh, another government UFO lie. You say, well, wait a minute, you're talking about Dr. Donald Menzel. He was a Harvard University professor of astronomy. Why are you saying government lies? Well, because I discovered, thanks to a grant from the Fund for UFO Research, and getting permission from 3 different people, one through the very good offices of Joan Thompson, who may be here tonight, was here yesterday anyway, I checked Donald Menzel's files, and it turns out that he worked for the National Security Agency, he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, he was a world-class expert on cryptography, made more from his consulting work than from his Harvard professorship once he retired. He wrote Jack Kennedy that he had a longer continuous association with the National Security Agency and its Navy predecessor, 30 years as of 1960, of anybody in the United States. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. That sounds like a government employee to me. And what he said was, all UFO sightings are by poor observers. Let's go back to that. We don't need to change the slides for this, but Blue Book Special Report 14 showed the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unknown. And he's telling us All UFO sightings are by poor observers. A flat-out, total, complete, unambiguous lie. Let's look at the next slide. There's Dr. Menzel. And you know, the funny thing is, I didn't like him before I did this study. He's listed in the MJ-12 documents. And our first response was, obviously somebody's pulling our leg. How could he be a member of this? And you don't need a high security clearance to teach at Harvard. Well, my discoveries show that he led a double life. And I had people say, how could anybody like Menzel lead a double life? Let me throw three names at you: Philby, Burgess, and McLean. These were three guys who worked for British intelligence, except that they were Russian spies. And they worked there for years. That's leading a double life. Menzel did too. He also wrote science fiction, incidentally. And his job seemed to be to get scientists off the trail of flying saucers. Let's look at the next slide. Now, not quite a government lie. This is Jesse Marcel Jr. He was on the Peter Jennings program. I saw him 3 weeks ago. He was in Roswell on leave. He's a colonel in the United States Army serving in Iraq. But he isn't just a colonel with 38 years of association with both the military and the reserve. He's also a medical doctor and a flight surgeon and a helicopter pilot. Peter Jennings didn't bother to mention any of those three things. Told you nice things about the SETI cultists on the program. Wouldn't you think that stuff goes to credibility? I would think so. Nobody can say he's anti-government, colonel, serving, flying, risking his life. We were down in Roswell together. It was 106 there. He said, you know, this is cool compared to Iraq. It gets up to 130. Got to wear flak jackets. Got to wear a helmet. Got to wear a sidearm. But Peter Jennings couldn't bother to mention those things. Of course, he also said Roswell is a myth. 4 times. The myth is that Roswell is a myth. Now, I'm not saying Peter Jennings works for the government. I was disappointed. Some of you may have read my critique of the program on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, or in UFO Magazine. I pointed out one of the reasons I had great expectations was that Peter and I share the same birthday, July 29th, and we're both dual citizens of the United States and Canada. I'd forgotten that Benito Mussolini is also born on July 29th. Let's look at the next slide. Now we get to MJ-12, Menzel and so forth. This is Colonel Weaver again, in letters to Nick Redfern and to myself. I can state that the Air Force considers the MJ-12, both the group described and the purported documents, to be bogus. He said that to Nick Redfern. Nick sent me a copy. I filed an appeal. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request, as did Nick, for all documents, letters, memos, et cetera, leading to that conclusion. We have nothing in response to your request. I filed an appeal. We still have nothing in response to your request. So here we have a colonel in the United States Air Force writing a man in England on official stationery, expressing a conclusion without providing any basis for it whatsoever. Not only did he do that, but he sent a set of the documents with the handwritten bogus on each page. And if you go to the FBI website, they used what Colonel Weaver wrote. He may consider it to be bogus, but I think that declaration is bogus because, as I point out in my book, new edition coming out next week now, there are no good arguments to be made against the genuineness of the original documents. The new edition has a whole chapter devoted to dealing with the myriad of attacks and debunking them. Let's look at the next slide. One of the documents, and there's a reason for showing it, I know it's hard to read. This is the Cutler-Twining memo. a brief memo from Robert Cutler, Ike's National Security Advisor, to General Twining, Air Force Chief of Staff at the time, saying that a briefing on MJ-12, National Security Council, NSC, MJ-12 Special Studies Project, is the only original document we have of the original ones. It's not on film. And one of the things is that the security marking is top secret restricted. Now, the federal government plus the Eisenhower Library both said that top secret restricted was not in use until the Nixon administration, 1969. We're talking about something dated 1954. Obviously, the documents are fraud. Now, why a forger would use an unusual, very high top secret, very low restricted combination, nobody knows. But it's not even a true statement that it wasn't in use. How do I know that? Because the General Accounting Office, which was looking for stuff about Roswell for Congressman Stephen Schiff, went all over looking through everybody's file. The CIA, when they went there, wanted to give them only what was released under Freedom of Information. These guys had clearances for everything. They prevailed. And they describe on page 80 of a big fat report about all the things they did looking and not finding much. We went to the certain facility, looked at stuff up through top secret from 51 to 56, something like that. And we didn't find anything about Roswell. However, we noted several instances of the use of top secret restricted, even though we had been told, Majestic 12 in parentheses, that it was not in use at that time. I immediately requested copies of those documents. They said, Stan, they're still classified. You can't get copies of them. But if the GAO says so, that's good enough for me. So the government lied. Two different parts of the government lied. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, there's no /S/ and no signature. Some people said, well, that proves it's phony. Sorry, it doesn't. He was out of the country at the time. If there had been a signature, it would have been phony. Now, the typeface is interesting. It's the large pica type. Well, nasty, noisy, negativist Phil Klass challenged me about that. Perhaps you didn't notice that it was done in the large pica type. Of course I had. I had noticed 3 different typewriters in use. But the National Security Council used only elite type, and I got 9 samples to prove it. He'd never been to the Eisenhower Library, but he got them in the mail. And I challenge you to find any genuine letters, memos, meeting a whole bunch of qualifications. And in order to get you to respond more quickly, I am offering you $100 each for every genuine such memo. Unfortunately, he said up to a limit of 10. I went to my files, pulled out 20, and most of them wouldn't meet his criteria. Definitely pica type. But I was going to the Eisenhower Library, and I was checking, I was looking for other stuff, and I came back. I sent him 14, same size and style, meeting all his criteria, and I sent him an invoice for $1,000, and he paid it. He told everybody about challenging me and nobody about paying me. And he got very angry when I included a copy of his check in my final report on Operation Majestic 12. Threatened to sue me. His father had been an attorney, so it was nice lawyerly sounding stuff. And so I told him, Phil, you sent me the check. I Xeroxed it. I cashed it. It was good. I can do whatever I darn please with the Xerox copy. And so it's in the report. But now people say, hey, wait a minute, you're talking about class. You thought you said government lies. There was a big investigation in the 70s by the Church Panel about the intelligence agencies and their co-opting of journalists. Phil was a perfect one. He wasn't married. He traveled widely. He was trained as an electrical engineer, went to conferences where there were Russians, could see what they were saying, could see what our guys were saying that they should have been saying. I would bet you 100 to 1 he was cooperating with the government. He's certainly lying enough about UFOs to have been working for the government. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, this just mentions that NSC MJ-12. It's actually onion skin paper. We won't go into it. Look at the next one. It's aged, incidentally. That's the whole thing. Next one, please. You can see the watermark on that. That's why that was shown. And here's the final report on Operation Majestic 12. It's 105 pages, I guess. And it's got Phil's check in it for me. There are copies at my table. And you may wonder about the title. Is that the last thing you did? Of course not, but I got a research grant from the Fund for UFO Research. Money that was raised exclusively to be used for the proposal that I had submitted to do research on MJ-12. I mention that because several people have asked me about the stuff on the internet saying Friedman is a disinformation specialist. That's because Milton William Cooper, the late and not lamented Milton William Cooper, who lied about a number of things, claimed that Bud Hopkins and Bruce Maccabee and I were disinformation agents, and that the money I used for my research came from the CIA. And since I worked for them, it was just the left hand paying the right hand. Of course, he provided no evidence, and he didn't bother to say that the money that the fund raised was exclusively for use on a proposal that I had submitted to them. So, no, I'm not a disinformation agent. I have to fess up, I did once work for the government. Christmas time in 1952, when I was a sophomore at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, I worked for the post office in Linden, New Jersey, my hometown, for 2 weeks. I did get a couple of paychecks from the United States government back then, and I earned them. Believe me, I was delivering mail. I was in better shape then than I am now. Let's look at the next slide. This is that comment, the actual statement about the acting director of the Freedom of Information Office at the NSC informed us that top secret restricted is a marking which did not come into use at the NSC until the Nixon administration. And the Eisenhower Presidential Library also confirmed that this particular marking was not used during the Eisenhower administration. Sorry, it was. Next slide. This is that statement that I was quoting to you. In several instances, we noted the classification top secret restricted used on several documents. This is mentioned because in the past reference to this classification, Majestic 12, we were told that it was not used during this period. That's from the GAO. Good enough for me. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, yeah, that's one of those exciting NSA documents. And the reason you can't read anything here is there was a little note that says whiteout was used. Terribly exciting stuff. And people say to me, when they said about the blacked out documents, well, can't you just scrape it off and see what's underneath? No, they Xerox it first, of course. There's nothing underneath. There's like 156 pages like this. Very exciting stuff. Let's look at the next slide. This is another one. They used a little blackout. And they use the word probably a balloon several times when they say UFOs. Now, all the rest of this is, we're supposed to believe, is sources and methods information. So why is it filed under UFOs? That make any sense to anybody? If it does, I've got a bridge I own near Brooklyn, New York, that I'd be happy to sell you at a very reasonable price. Maybe people don't know about selling the Brooklyn Bridge anymore. That's too small. Golden Gate Bridge. Let's look at the next slide. Here's one of those wonderful CIA UFO documents that it took me 5 years to get. Doc reference, something date, I can't read those from here, and then a bunch of numbers and stuff like that. They're not covering anything up. And incidentally, I went back to the CIA after this change in executive orders and asked for the same documents again, and there wasn't one, even half a sentence, uncovered. But they're not withholding any information. There is no cover-up. Well, except for the stuff you can't read because we won't release it. Next slide. Oh, I used that twice. Double plug. Let's go on to the next one. Oh yes, technology. There has been no evidence submitted. This is from Air Force Colonel Schubert to the senator from, and I've got 30 other letters. It was a standard response to a whole bunch of members of Congress. And they got away with it. There's been no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force. So if it was submitted to somebody else, that wouldn't count. That sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. Now, you got to think about that. What are they saying here? Well, I worked on nuclear airplanes back in 1956. We actually operated jet engines on nuclear power. We haven't flown any big nuclear-powered airplanes, as far as I know. Leave that one up there and go to the next one. There's a nuclear ramjet flown in the early 60s, Ling Temco Vought. Haven't built any operational ones. The idea was to move at high speed with nuclear weapons, military system. That's a real reactor, and it did work. Let's look at the next one. There's a nuclear rocket reactor right in there. Here's the nozzle. I worked on this one, NRXA-6, while at Westinghouse. Had some experiments on it. You don't stand next to this thing while it's running, incidentally. You get cooked in a hurry. It's about this big. The power level was only 1,100 megawatts, which is half the power of Grand Coulee Dam. This was tested in 1968. No evidence of technology beyond our knowledge. Well, this isn't. We still aren't using any such systems, of course. Let's look at the next one. Aerojet General built this one. It was only 1,000 megawatts, but this was much more in a real configuration. Big tank of liquid hydrogen up here. Reactor here. This was downward firing. The others were upward firing. Next slide. Tested out near Area 51, folks. Los Alamos built this one, a little bigger. You've got to put some shielding around these things. It was about this big. Power level was only 4,400 megawatts, twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam, and this big. That's not technology beyond our knowledge. The program was canceled like all the other programs I worked on. I worked on nuclear fusion propulsion. That's what goes on in the sun back in the early 60s. If you use the right stuff in the right way and kick particles out the back end that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as you can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. It's not technology beyond our knowledge. We haven't built one yet that works in outer space. So it's another lie. Misrepresentation, does that sound? That's too polite when people are lying to you. Let's look at the next one. This is one of the test cells. Spent a lot of money on these things. This is out in Nevada, not far from Area 51. Let's look at the next. Oh, an electromagnetic submarine. No moving parts. Tested successfully by Dr. Stuart Way, man in the middle down here, from Westinghouse, on leave at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And a bunch of graduate students. They spent $2,000. If it had been a government program, it would have been $200,000. It probably wouldn't have worked, but no moving parts. Moves silently through the seawater. And you put that in the air and ionize the air. Seawater is an electrically conducting fluid. If you ionize the air, that becomes an electrically conducting fluid. That's when you see when a meteor comes in, you ionize the air and make it electrically conducting. I did a literature search when working briefly for McDonnell Douglas using the keyword magnetoaerodynamics. Got 900 references. 90% were classified. We still haven't built any such systems to the best of my knowledge. No evidence of technology beyond our knowledge. We haven't built things that can duplicate the behavior of flying saucers. And how about the huge motherships? We have a lot of reports of really big ones. One out in the Yukon, 30 witnesses in groups of 2 or 3. A civil engineer did a triangulation It was between 0.6 and 1.2 miles long. Miles. We building things like that? I don't think so. It's technology beyond our knowledge. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, two other sources of information, the UFO evidence, congressional hearings. Best paper from the congressional hearings is out on my table. Dr. James E. McDonald looked at 41 separate cases, all kinds of cases, radar visual, multiple witness, over big cities, et cetera, sightings by astronomers and pilots and so forth. And yet you will hear these guys say there aren't any good cases. Lies and lies. The UFO evidence information on 4,500 cases investigated by the mostly professional members of NICAP, the old organization. 700 and some could not be identified. Next one. Oh, the Condon report. $539,000 of our money went into this. The National Academy of Sciences gave its stamp of approval to this. Condon was a member of the National Academy. That is a government-supported agency. They didn't check on one investigation. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics did check on a lot of them. They found that 30% of the 117 cases studied in detail could not be identified. There's several papers pointing out what was wrong with both what the National Academy of Sciences said and what Condon said. He didn't do any investigations either. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Let's look at the next one. There's no physical evidence, people from the government say. Seth Shostak says that too. This is from one of Ted Phillips' more than 3,000 physical trace cases out in Delphos, Kansas. I was here. There was a ring 9 feet in diameter, 14 inches down, dried out, definitely different from surrounding soil. Let's look at the next slide, and we'll look at some of the characteristics. The ring soil won't support plant growth. Normal soil does fine from just a few feet away. Next slide. Ring soil won't absorb moisture. Just sits there. That's water on ring soil. Normal soil makes instant mud. So any government agent who tells you there is no physical evidence is lying. Of course, any civilian who tells you that is lying also, but we're talking about government UFO lies today. Let's look at the next one. Oh, this is ring soil on the left, normal soil on the right. Good lab test done. Higher level of soluble minerals on the left. I'm sure the Air Force wouldn't find that. They wouldn't be able to find anybody who could do an analysis, I'm sure. Could have been microwaved soil, but the farmer didn't have any way of microwaving the soil 14 inches down in a 9-foot diameter ring back in the 70s. Let's look at the next slide. Now, here's an intentional lie, but you can understand it. There's a famous memo from General Twining. I mentioned him before in the Cutler-Twining memo. September 1947. It's a two-pager. Due consideration must be given the following, he said. The lack of physical evidence in the shape of crash-recovered exhibits which would undeniably prove the existence of these objects. Well, that proves that there was no Roswell, right? Wrong. It was only classified secret. There's no question, as Wilbert Smith said in Canada, most classified subject in the United States, classified more highly than the H-bomb, that he couldn't talk about top secret information in a secret memo. This does not prove we didn't have any information. It says we didn't have anything rated secret or below. That's one of the rules, incidentally. You can't reference higher classified information in lower classified documents, because then you'd have to classify it higher. That's the rules of the game. Let's look at the next one. This is, I've got a few copies left of the 50th anniversary edition, Crash at Corona. all about Roswell. It goes into other lies as well. They're out at the table, bargain priced. I've heard more lies about Roswell than you can imagine. I've become a focal point, I guess, because I'm the original civilian investigator. And that's another thing that you'll hear, not just Colonel Weaver, but others lie about. Why did Jesse Marcel come running to you, Friedman? He didn't, is the simple answer. I found out about him. I was at a television station in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, ready to do 3 interviews before speaking at LSU that night back in 1978. I did the first 2 interviews. The third reporter was nowhere to be found. No cell phones back then, so the station manager, he knew the person who brought me to the station. He's looking at his watch. He's embarrassed. He's giving me coffee. He's hoping she shows up pretty quick. Out of the blue, he says, you know, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant field investigator that I am, I said, who's he? Oh, well, he handled pieces of the wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in. He was in the military. What? You know, what do you know about him? Lives over in Houma, Louisiana. Great guy, we're old ham radio buddies. Then the reporter showed up. Next day, I called Jesse from the airport. Look, called information first, got his number, called him. He told me his story, but didn't know the exact date. And I heard his second story in Bemidji, Minnesota. And then I shared that with Bill Moore. He had a third story about an English actor driving across the country, hearing on the radio about a crashed saucer in New Mexico, expecting a big to-do in Philadelphia when he got there from LA. Nothing. Located his son, pinned down the date, because it wasn't a trip you made very often back then. You can imagine what the roads were like in '47. Early July 1947. Bill went to the University of Minnesota Library, started looking. You know, Peter Jennings says, the witnesses just came out of the woodwork. A lie, flat out. Bill found the articles in the newspapers. That gave us the names of other people. We researched, by 1980, we talked to 62 people. Did any of these people come running to us? No. This is before the internet. We had to go looking, and looking hard. They didn't come running to us. They didn't come out of the woodwork. And when I talked to that television station manager years later, what did Jesse tell you when you spoke to him about this? Well, it turns out he didn't tell him anything. The station manager, Don Allen, had seen the article in the Times-Picayune out of New Orleans. And back then, when you had a military man's name in an article, they usually talked about what town he was from. So when Jesse moved back to Houma, 48, 49, and they ham radioed back and forth, he asked him, and Jesse told him, I can't tell you anything about that. So these witnesses crawling out of the woodwork or running to Friedman, total nonsense, lies. Next slide. I think that's the last one, isn't it? It's the last one. Well, our time's just about right. Let me sum all this up. We live in a world in which apparently government agencies feel it is perfectly okay to lie. The rule is make sure you can get away with it. I mean, I'm sure you're aware that there must be weapons of mass destruction over there in Iraq. There must be a link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11, mustn't there? And flying saucers is nothing to them, right? Now, let me deal with one little part of that. Some people tell me governments can't keep secrets, especially not one like this, and not for this long. Director of Central Intelligence, in 1996, because of a lawsuit, admitted that his black budget for that year was $26.6 billion. That's not 12 professors and 24 grad students. Are there any secrets that have been kept for a long time? Well, yes, as a matter of fact. The English had broken the German codes. They had 12,000 people at Bletchley Park intercepting, decoding, and translating the German military communications. Not one word in public for 25 years. Office of Naval Intelligence, or the Naval Research Lab, launched the first electronic intelligence satellite, the Corona satellite. The first public announcement was 1995 in a booklet in which they were bragging about all their contributions to national defense over the previous 75 years. Oh, the Corona was first launched successfully in 1960. First public word, 1995. It got more electronic intelligence information about the Soviet Union than all the U-2 flights which preceded it. There had to be hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved in that program. And there were 12 failures. The 13th one worked, interestingly enough. But governments can't keep secrets. The Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb spent roughly $20 billion. 60,000 people at one time, most of whom didn't know what was going on. They were following orders, doing what they were supposed to do, turn the dial this way if the needle goes this way, kind of thing. Can't keep secrets. The stealth fighter was developed, 57 of them built over a period of 10 years, several $billion spent, not one word in public during that period of time. Of course governments can keep secrets, and you don't do it by telling everybody. The basic rule is need to know. Example of that, I had a Q clearance to look at radiation shielding information up through secret restricted data when I was working on nuclear airplanes. You know what? I couldn't get any of the Navy radiation shielding work. Same level of security, but Admiral Rickover wouldn't give me a need to know. Couldn't get access. Secrets are being kept all the time. I'm not saying that's all bad. But let's be realistic. We're going to have to push awful hard to get the press and the scientific community to do its job, to get rid of the nonsense put out by these SETI cultists. You all know what SETI stands for, a silly effort to investigate. It's time for a new leaf to be turned over. A little more honesty. Do I want all the technical data put out on the table? No, I do not. Why put it out where Osama bin Laden can get at it? Remember, the key rule for security is you cannot tell your friends without telling your enemies. They read the papers too. They listen to radio. They listen to television. So, yes, the government is lying. There are more details in my paper, which is in the proceedings, which are available outside. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to having lunch with somebody tomorrow. I don't know who. I'm being served for lunch? No, that doesn't sound right. I think I'm worth more than $1 a pound already. MUFON could use all the help it can get, so please bid high, not low. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you, folks, for staying up as long as you have with us this evening. It's been a long day and lots of knowledge that we've got to absorb. We'll see you bright and early tomorrow at 8:30. So have a good night's sleep. And for those of you that are driving home, drive safe. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Barely see the UFO up here, but look at the next slide, and you'll see an enlargement. And I use this one in honor of my living in Canada. I'm a dual citizen. I can complain about both governments legally. This was investigated by Dr. Richard Haynes, former NASA scientist, collected over 4,000 pilot sightings, worked with astronauts, worked with abductees, was interviewed for the Peter Jennings Monster Show, and none of it was used. Typical of what you might expect, I guess. Let's look at the next one. I show this one. There's much more to the picture and so forth, but I hope some of you, well, I'm not sure I hope so, but some of you must have seen the Larry King special a couple of weeks ago, in which the UFO experts in the form of Dr. Seth Shostak, one of the city cultists, as I call them, and Dr. Susan Clancy, of Harvard, they identified these pictures, well, just somebody tossing a hubcap. The fact that they'd been analyzed by Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist, at great length was beside the point. You don't need to look at the evidence. Why should we do that? We know that there's nothing to this. As you might determine, I'm a little bitter about the garbage that's been dumped on the public by some of the nasty, noisy negativists. This is from Santa Ana, California, one of the Rex Heflin photos. Exhaustive analysis in Ain't a Small Object Close to the Camera. Let's look at the next one. There's me and Dr. Shostak. I think he will be shocked. He sent me a picture. We were both on the Queen Elizabeth II a year and a half ago, and we each gave 3 lectures. Now, we attended each other's lectures, but he obviously didn't hear anything of mine, or totally ignored the evidence that he did hear. But he took my picture, and he sent me a copy to do with as I pleased, and it will be on the back of the new edition of my book, Top Secret Magic, due out next week. And it gives him credit for it. He's a good photographer, doesn't know anything about flying saucers. It was an interesting discussion on Coast to Coast one night when we did 3 hours. Let's look at the next slide. Okay. Government UFO lies. Definition, lie. An untrue statement made with intent to deceive. It's not just enough that it be untrue, but there has to be an intention to deceive. That's a Webster's definition. Let's look at the next slide. That looks awful dark. This is the cover of the largest study of flying saucers ever done for the United States Air Force, Project Blue Book, Special Report 14. 13 anti-UFO books don't even mention it, even though all the authors were aware of it. We have to review the 4 basic rules for UFO debunkers. And for those of you who want to debunk anything else, these work just as well for that too. First, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Second, don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Third, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. And fourth, do your research by proclamation, as Dr. Shostak and Dr. Clancy did the other day on Larry King. Investigation is too much trouble. Let's look at the next slide. Here's what was said about this report by the Secretary of the Air Force, mind you. 1955, very wide distribution for the press release, none for the report. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects, such as those properly described as flying saucers, have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. There's the date on that. That's what he said. 2 facts. Unknown 3%. Oh, you're not using that. I thought you were using 2 of them. Oh, dear. Getting old. Let's look at the next slide. This is a definition of unknown. This designation is the identification code was assigned to those reports of sightings wherein the description of the object and its maneuvers could not be fitted to the pattern of any known object or phenomena. That seems reasonable to me. The kicker comes when we look at the next definition. In the next slide. Insufficient information. They had a separate category. This identification category was assigned to a report when, upon final consideration, there was some essential item of information missing. Now, here's the important thing. It is emphasized that this category was not used as a convenient way to dispose of what might be called poor unknowns. Now, let's look at the facts from the study in the next slide. This is the categorization. 3,200 sightings, pretty good number. For those of you who worry about such things, this is really psychological aberrations. A nice way of saying crackpot cases. Here are the unknowns. They were, of course, only 3%. Oops. They weren't 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 10. They were 21.5%. I call that a lie. Flat out, unambiguous lie. The unknowns were not 3% or even close. Equally important is that category we just mentioned, insufficient information. If there wasn't enough data available, it was not an unknown. And yet, over and over again, in the 50 years or so since this came out, we hear the only reason sightings couldn't be explained is that there wasn't enough data. It wasn't true then, it isn't true now. Let's see the facts and not the fiction. Now, on top of that, they did a quality evaluation of all those sightings. Let's look at the next slide. Of the excellent cases, only 35% were unknown. Only is an Air Force word. Whenever they mention unknowns, it's only. Now, what if I was talking about cures for cancer? We looked at 3,201 drugs, and I guess there aren't any cures for cancer. Now, leave that one up there, please. Please, we got to look at the rest of the data there. Only 35% of the best drugs worked. I guess there's no cure for cancer. And you'd say, hey, you're crazy, man. All it takes is one. But the better the quality of the sighting, moving up, the more likely to be an unknown. Exactly the opposite of what you'd expect, based on the Air Force statement, and precisely what you'd expect if the unknowns are really something different. So they lied to give us a totally false picture of what was going on. Now we can look at the next slide, please. Now, I'm going to talk about Roswell for a bit, and I'm not sure what you can read. There's a point to showing you, these are front page newspaper headlines from evening papers from Chicago West, July 8th, 1947. And buried someplace in this story, it says, found last week. Found last week. This is the Chicago Daily News. Next slide. Oh boy, that looks rather strange. Anyway, Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Don't know what happened.
Welcome back to the final speaker of the day. And I don't know if Stan remembers, but I first met him at a conference held by the late Graham Birdsall in Birmingham, I think it was, back in 1993. And it was wonderful to exchange conversation with such an incredible mind. standing outside the building while waiting for the doors to open to the conference. Stanton T. Friedman has both a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degrees in physics, and was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist for such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet, General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas on such advanced, classified, eventually cancelled projects as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and nuclear power plants for space. Since 1967, he's lectured on the topic, Flying Saucers Are Real, at more than 600 colleges and over 100 professional groups in 50 states, 9 provinces, and 14 other countries. He's published more than 80 UFO papers and appeared on hundreds of radio and TV programs. He's the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident and co-authored Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident. As well as Top Secret Magic, his explosive book about the Majestic 12 group, established in 1947 to deal with crash sources. Stanton Friedman takes a clear-cut, ambiguous stand that some UFOs are alien spacecraft, that the subject of flying saucers represents a cosmic Watergate, that none of the anti-UFO arguments made by a variety of noisy negativists stand up to careful scrutiny, and that we're dealing with the biggest story of the past millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft and the successful cover-up by governments of the best data. Alien wreckage and bodies recovered in New Mexico for 58 years. And what a truly marvelous moment when Stan was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award in Leeds, England, in September of 2002 by UFO Magazine of the UK. A documentary, Stanton T. Friedman is Real, was broadcast in Canada 2002. And we're delighted to introduce the very real Stanton Friedman to present to you the very real government UFO lies.
Thank you. Do I need to use this thing? That mic? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm told that I can make up for lost time. I'm not going to talk faster to get the talk done sooner. I'll take the time that we were delayed and extend that. A couple of things. One is that if you haven't already, you should buy the proceedings for the conference. There's a copy of my paper, which I will not read to you, a copy of a lot of other papers, including one by Alan Holt, who isn't here, so you can't possibly hear his, and a statement by Edgar Mitchell. If you're wondering about a luncheon companion for tomorrow noon, I understand they've gotten up to $1 a pound on me back there for the silent auction. I don't think people very often use the word silent in conjunction with me. And I know some of you with sensitive hearts and souls may be upset that I would use a lecture title that suggests that the government lies. We all know that governments don't lie to their people. Some of the time. Most of the time they do, but that's another story. Okay. Tonight I do want to, rather than just talking about the cosmic Watergate, focus on specific false statements made by various government agencies and individuals about UFOs. This is not a charismatic hand-waving, well, they lie all the time, you can't believe anything they say. No. I'll deal with specifics. You may be able to read my slides. I'm not sure if I can from here, but we'll give it a whirl. Let's turn the projector on. And in the first slide, I don't even know what we're going to see. Yes, I would have brought him along, but I couldn't get him a visa. Since I live in Canada, you understand. I guess you could call me an alien too, can't you? A guy had great fun taking a bunch of pictures like this, and I couldn't resist using it. Let's look at the next slide, and you'll see I have to show you a UFO picture, you understand. That's part of the rules of the game. And you can